Welcome to Newsmakers, a co-production between the Epoch Times and NTD. I'm your host, Roman Balmakov.
And I'm your other host, Tiffany Meyer. We have a great lineup of guests for you tonight. But before we get to them, there's a new record out, and it's not a good one. We're talking the nation's report card, also known as test scores for how the nation's children are doing. That's in terms of both reading and math. And the latest numbers for grade 4 and 8 are out, and they're not good. In terms of math, those numbers plunged by record-setting levels for both 4th and 8th graders. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress results, math scores declined for those grades in nearly every state and district between the last 3 years. That's when the pandemic was. Officials at the Department of Education described these numbers as troubling, concerning, and even appalling. According to the Education Department, which released the scores, reading scores also fell in most states during these COVID years. As for what that means, the Associated Press noted that the pandemic wiped out decades of academic progress in America, and it impacted the minority groups harder. Many of these areas didn't have the tools to log into Zoom classes, for example, get a tutor, or have a quiet environment at home to study in. As for just how far back this progress went, reading scores dropped at the same level as back in 1992. And as for math, those fell to record lows too, in the 53 years since testing began. To put these into perspective, nearly 40% of 8th graders failed to grasp basic math concepts. And as for the state of the whole country, not a single state saw any significant improvement in average test scores. That being said, some states did better than others. For example, Alabama and Louisiana actually did better. But Delaware, the District of Columbia or D.C., Maryland, Virginia, New Mexico all saw major declines. And U.S. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona saying now that there must be a nationwide effort to recover and move students forward. Now, what does this all mean for the future? While life for many are going back to normal, now the after effects of the lockdowns could only just be starting to show up. Roman, what do you make of all these numbers?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think the thing that struck out to me the most from your monologue was the idea that it hit minority students the hardest, because it's sort of this ironic twist of fate where it's like the current party in power, of course, wants to, at least within their rhetoric and of course with the policies they enact, help minorities. But then on the flip side, the policies that they push in terms of lockdowns, like I guess it set everybody back, but especially minorities, like you said, it disproportionately affected them for those various reasons you listed out. And it's like, that's the worst, right? Because, I mean, think about it, like, education is the ladder up. Like, there's what better ladder is there? Even if you inherit a bunch of money, you're probably going to waste it, right? Education is the only way to really generationally climb you and your family higher. And it's like, that's devastating that you had those losses. I guess for me, the only silver lining here is that this now, because it's so drastic, will become an actual topic of discussion. Because before, all those parents at the school boards are coming in, they're yelling about critical race theory and trans ideology being injected into the classroom, which are, don't get me wrong, absolutely valid concerns. But it's like, now it's like, it's so bad that, well, okay, you can kind of argue the merits of that, but it's like, hey, you see this test score here? You see this test score? Like, it's like a concrete number that you can't argue against. So at the very least, I believe that the silver lining is that this might be a herald for some real change. Yeah.
Well, on that too, it's like we did see a rise in homeschooling, for example, during the pandemic. So some families really took it into their own hands to try and solve this. It's actually like not even these scores for the past few years, average test scores have already been going down, but I think it was really exacerbated under the pandemic, which is really sad because who knows what's going to be the future for these kids, right? Like, can they get into college down the road? Like, how long do they need to even just catch up?
Yeah, and as you mentioned regarding the homeschooling, I believe the number of people homeschooling their kids has risen in, if I'm not mistaken, double digits over the last 2 years, which kind of just ties into this general loss of trust in America's institutions, because people are just losing trust in the education system, and so they're pulling their kids out. And also, of course, they're losing trust in other systems and agencies as well, like, for instance, the FBI.
The FBI especially has been in the news a lot more recently, whether in regards to Trump's Mar-a-Lago raid, the Steele dossier, and ensuing Durham trial, or January 6 cases. And joining us in just a moment to help shed light onto the Bureau is FBI whistleblower Steve Friend. Friend is a 12-year FBI veteran and SWAT team member. He was suspended from the Bureau in mid-September. He was stripped of his badge and gun and escorted out of his Florida FBI field office. This was after he reportedly complained to his supervisors about what he saw as violations of FBI policy. 2 days after that, on September 21st, Friend filed a whistleblower complaint with the Department of Justice Inspector General. In that complaint, he alleged that the FBI field office had been using a, quote, overzealous January 6th investigation to harass and violate the constitutional rights of conservative Americans. In addition, he alleged that the field office was cooking the books to exaggerate the threat of domestic terrorism. And joining us now to talk about the complaint and what has been happening since is the man himself, FBI Special Agent Steve Friend. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
So Steve, to begin, what did you see in the FBI? What did you see in the FBI that really made you speak out?
Well, I saw that we weren't following the rules when it came to managing our cases. Typically, the rules spell out that the case managers get assigned really run all the investigative actions that take place and are responsible for making sure that everything is done properly. I had 200 plus cases that I opened in my career, and the only time that I saw us deviate from that was with the January 6 cases, which, although they were opened and assigned to us in the field, were really essentially being run from Washington, D.C.
How are they supposed to be run? Let's say in a perfect world, how would those investigations have been run?
Well, there's some latitude on how to do it. You could make arguments on multiple different ways. But to me, opening a case in Washington would have made a lot of sense. Maybe one large case with lots of subjects that you would be investigating, and you could request the field do certain investigative activities like interview or collect evidence. Even if they wanted to open up a separate case for each person, it could be done from Washington. But once they made the decision that they were going to open up the cases in the field, and from what I understood, that was to get quote unquote buy-in from the field, they had to be more hands-off and let the agents in those respective offices do their jobs.
Oh, that's interesting. So I want to actually focus on that a little bit. So you said to get quote-unquote buy-in. Was it because the directors of the FBI, the people in that position, they did not feel like the agents on the ground, they really were into the January 6th investigation? They didn't ideologically agree with it, and that's why they chose to do it this way? Was that the case?
I can only speculate on the meaning of that. That's certainly one way to interpret it. To me, that seems like a pretty macabre view of the agents, because we're professionals and we would do anything that you asked us to do for your case, because we'd expect the same sort of treatment if we made a request for one of our own.
Yeah. So how did it actually wind up playing out? So were the case files of these J6 people, were they moved around the country?
Yes, so a separate case was open for every single person, and they were opened up around the country depending on where that individual lived, which is within FBI rules. But once that case is assigned to that area, that case owns that case. That area owns that case. Those managers run that case the way that they see fit. But instead, when it came to January 6th, we were performing certain tasks and at the behest of Washington, and we were sending cases to them for their review, and then ultimately they would kick them back for additional work, or they were making the decision on whether or not to charge individuals. And that is clearly not, as our rules define, that we're supposed to be running our cases. And that's really was what the nuts and bolts of what my complaint were to the supervisors. I felt that we were violating our rules, and there's a potential constitutional concerns. I want to win when we go to trial if this is a legitimate charge, and I thought that we were sort of putting ourselves at risk of having violated the very rules that we were supposed to uphold to make sure that we're bringing forth a very strong prosecution.
Wow. So when you were seeing this play out and you became a whistleblower, how did that affect you? What wound up taking place, and how did it affect you and your family?
I brought my concerns to 3 separate levels of management: immediate supervisor, the assistant special agents in charge of my field office, and ultimately the special agent in charge. They heard me out. They disagree with my view on the rule violations. They disagree with my points on the potential heavy-handedness of the way that we were going to be arresting subjects. And at all levels, they said to me, I needed to question whether or not I wanted to continue to work for the FBI. And that finally came to a head last month when I was suspended. My security clearance was suspended for, raising my concerns and not wanting to participate in the J6 takedowns, and also for an unrelated matter where they said that I improperly accessed the employee handbook.
Mm. Wow.
And Steve, just to jump in real quick, I saw headlines talking about how your wife was also censored. Is that true? What happened there?
Yes, my wife has a private Facebook account. We received some outreach from some individuals. She sent them a private message. She sends only private messages, doesn't post anything publicly, and in fact, her name on her profile doesn't match mine, so nobody would have any way to know her. The private message she sent out, though, said, "I'm Steve Friend's wife. We really appreciate the support. Just please help to share the message." At that point, I hadn't been speaking publicly, and within 30 minutes, her Facebook account was suspended for violating the community standards, and it was shut down the following day.
Wow. And just to clarify, your wife isn't in the FBI, right? She's just a civilian?
Yes, she's not an FBI agent. Works a separate private job.
Wow. So I guess the last question I would have for you is, what do you think this would mean, or what does this mean for the FBI moving forward? What kind of an agency do you foresee this country having, let's say, 2, 5, 10 years from now, if it continues down this path?
My hope is that, me bringing this attention to the American public, there's going to be a lot more oversight. I'm afraid that the FBI has become a little bit too politicized with how it's doing things, and certainly with manipulating the terrorist statistics to further a narrative. The FBI exists to maintain law and order, and by giving this illusion that domestic terrorism is a nationwide threat, I think we're raising the temperature. It's going to lead to more disorder and more controversy. So I hope that maybe leadership will take a better temperature of its own personnel, because a lot of the agents out there agree with me and just haven't had mustered the courage yet to step up and say something. And I hope that maybe that we'll resolve ourselves to do better in following our rules and serve the public that we swore an oath to protect.
It's a very optimistic way to end it. Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah, with Steve, one of the things that really stood out to me that he was saying was how, in his opinion, based on what he saw, was that the agency was cooking the books in regards to domestic terrorism. And the reason that really stood out to me is because, like, if you've been following sort of the narrative that's coming out of the government, and especially the DOJ, is that, the biggest threat right now is right-wing extremism and white supremacy extremist groups. And while I don't doubt that they represent a threat, maybe even a significant threat, it's like to say that they're the biggest threat. When you compare that to other things in this country, it's like either they're seeing something I'm not, or they're a bit politicized and they are pushing sort of the narrative, which unfortunately kind of then wraps people up. Like, for instance, the guest that we have coming up next.
Actually, yeah, speaking of politics and the FBI, we're going to stick with the FBI topic for a bit. But coming up, we're going to hear from pro-life activist Mark Houck, who found himself raided by the Bureau. To hear all about what happened, stick around. Mark joins us after the break.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. Joining us in a moment will be a pro-life supporter who regularly prays outside of a Philadelphia abortion clinic. However, he is at the moment facing federal charges for allegedly assaulting a clinic escort. Pro-lifer Mark Houck is a Catholic father of 7, and his family says that he was arrested Friday morning by more than 24 FBI agents who came to the door with their guns drawn. Now, a senior FBI source actually told Fox News that the guns were not drawn and only around 15 to 20 agents were at the home. Now, if convicted, Houck faces up to 11 years in prison. The alleged assault incident took place around this time last year, when a 72-year-old Planned Parenthood clinic escort accused Houck of shoving him to the ground. Houck countered by saying he was defending his 12-year-old son from harassment. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, meanwhile indicted Houck under the FACE Act, which makes it a federal crime to forcibly interfere with someone seeking or providing an abortion. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Josh Hawley says there's an, quote, epidemic of violence against pro-life advocates, and he's calling on the U.S. Attorney General to testify before Congress to provide answers. Hawley wants to know why the DOJ has not identified a single prosecution in response to violence against pro-life pregnancy centers, houses of worship, and pro-life Americans, and why the selective use of the FACE Act, which in the case of Mark Houck, Hawley says is being weaponized for political purposes. Joining us now is a Catholic pro-life activist, Mark Houck, who is the father of 7 as well as an author from the great state of Pennsylvania. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, can you sort of tell us your story? What happened? What was the backstory to this FBI raid?
Well, I'm not at liberty to talk about the case, but suffice it to say that on September 23rd at 7 a.m., over 24 FBI agents and PA state troopers barged on my door or slammed their hands on the door at 7 a.m. and told me to open up. And I didn't know who they were. I actually asked them to identify themselves. And when they told me it was the FBI, I gently, calmly opened up the door with my hands raised so that they could stay calm. I had told them I have 7 children in my home and I needed them to stay calm. So this apparently was a response to some pro-life work that I have been doing for the last couple years. And I'm not really sure exactly why all those federal agents were at my house, frankly.
How many federal agents would you say? How big was this raid?
Sure, there was about 15 marked and unmarked units on the property, on the side of the property, in the front of the house. My whole front yard was swarming with them. Ballistic shields, ballistic helmets, heavily armored vests and artillery. 5 long guns were pointing at me, kind of like an AR-15, more like an M16. After I did further investigation, were pointed at me, my wife, and my 7 children.
Wow. So, you know, when I first read your story, I was shocked, especially this seems to be kind of an escalating sort of trail of events like this happening, unfortunately. Maybe, I know you said you weren't allowed to talk about your case, but can you give us a bit of background to the best extent you can? Like, what led up to this? Why did this happen, and what kind of pro-life work were you doing that the FBI suddenly raided your home?
Right. So for the last 20 years, I've been on the sidewalks in the streets of Philadelphia doing sidewalk counseling. And so, you know, that's a First Amendment protected right where we just walk alongside abortion-minded men and women. And there was a bit of an altercation in 2021, October 13th of 2021, that was handled in the Philadelphia district. It was dismissed. It was a case that was dismissed. And about 8 months later from the dismissal, 7 to 8 months later, but a full year practically from the altercation, the arrest took place. Now, my federal, my lawyer was a former federal prosecutor, and he communicated with the assistant U.S. attorney that we would produce ourselves, that we were peaceful, that there would be no issue if they decided to indict us. However, they didn't respond to that, and they decided to take it into their own hands and come to my house with heavily armed officers and agents.
Wow. So, Mark, last question: How did this raid affect your family, your especially your 7 children?
Well, sure. That's the biggest problem of it all. That's who the true victims are in all this. My wife, my children. We're still dealing with it a month later when it comes to their trauma, and it was an act of terror on our family. And so my one daughter is afraid of Fridays. You know, these are the things that she says. And my other children, you can just tell internally, psychologically, emotionally, they're not the same people. They're not as joyful. They're scared. They're not the type of people that we were raising, even though they have that great constitution as young people. They're resilient. They live in fear right now, which is a crime as far as I'm concerned. It's so tragic and traumatic. And just to think of the sheer recklessness of it all, it's amazing someone didn't get shot that day.
Yeah, well, that is, I guess, the silver lining in this all. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yep, sure. Thanks for having me.
Wow, no, that is quite a story, especially in regards to his kids. You know, I can imagine. I don't know the ages of his 7 kids, but I imagine if there's 7, they're some young and old. But if you're a young kid and you got your house raided by the FBI, like he said, like his daughter's afraid of Fridays now. I mean, how long could that last? That could potentially last for years, right?
Right. Who knows, like, how long these effects are, and when they can recover from it and really not be afraid of Fridays anymore, for example, for this one little girl. But actually, going on what you said earlier about domestic threats versus external threats, our next guest is going to be talking about another big threat, which is that from the Communist Party of China. And joining us after a quick break is General Robert Spalding. He's going to talk about Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader who just secured his 3rd term. What does it mean for America, and more? Find out after the break. Welcome back to Newsmakers. We're shifting gears now to what top intelligence agencies are calling the biggest threat facing us right now, and that is Communist China. And joining us to help explain all of this is General Robert Spalding. He's a retired Air Force Brigadier General and the author of Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept, and War Without Rules: China's Playbook for Global Domination. General, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you.
So let's start with Chinese leader Xi Jinping securing his 3rd term, breaking rank from tradition over the weekend, right? So given Xi's Marxist, Leninist, Maoist philosophy of a rising communist China and a weakening America, what does Xi's 3rd term mean for us?
Well, I think the good news is that we actually can see very clearly what kind of nation China will be. It's going to be totalitarian. It's not going to be market-based. And I think what we saw, especially right after with the removal of Hu Jintao, the financial industry reacting in a way that lets you know they understand that China is becoming totalitarian and non-market based. That's a good thing. I think on the bad thing, on the bad side of the ledger, we're going to find out that China is going to be much more aggressive, both militarily and with regard to foreign policy. And I think this is going to be a big challenge for the free world.
Yeah, General, on social media this weekend, these videos started making the rounds of Hu Jintao getting sort of escorted away from the conference. With the media kind of flipping it and saying like, hey, it was kind of a medical emergency, he needed to get let out, but it kind of, at least in my opinion, didn't look like that. What's up with that? What do you make of that, and what's maybe the deeper meaning that we can read into that if we can?
Well, if you remember when President Obama went to China and forced him to come down the stairs, not at the front of the airplane, but at the back of the airplane. I remember talking to people at the embassy, and they were telling me, well, no, it was logistics. It was a problem. And that just belies an understanding of what the Chinese Communist Party do in terms of scripting these events. They're highly scripted. They're highly choreographed. Every movement is known. And so in the case of Obama, they wanted to send a message, and they wanted to embarrass him. In the case of Hu Jintao, it was a clear message to everybody that they picked up the former chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and actually had one of the attendants physically lift him up and escort him out. That was a message that Xi is in charge, and he will brook no disagreements with his policies.
In general, going off of that, like China leaving the market sector and this incident with Hu Jintao, how do you see this affecting U.S.-China conflict or competition going forward?
Well, I think, again, it's good news in that I think Washington, D.C., in terms of a bipartisan basis, understands what China is now. I think, though, the business sector, corporate sector, the financial sector have been able to push back quite hard. And both from the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, have been able to delay a lot of the policies that we need to do to protect ourselves and to rebuild our economy in terms of infrastructure and manufacturing. I think all of that will kind of slide away now as the business community understands that there's no longer money to be made in China. You're going to have to go somewhere else. And I think the good news for us is they're going to go to free societies. They're going to go to America. They're going to go to Europe. They're going to go to democracies where in the past we've been sending all of our technology, talent, and capital to China.
In general, on that point, then, what should the U.S.'s priorities be in dealing with China going forward?
Well, the priority for America should be in just that, rebuilding our infrastructure, rebuilding manufacturing, investing in science and technology and STEM education. It should not be in building, a huge military capacity. That's a mistake that the Soviet Union made with regard to the United States during the first Cold War. And I think that's a mistake that China wants us to make. It wants us to spend enormous resources on the military. Instead, we need to focus on deterrence, deterring conflict, and really focus on building the economic power of the United States. That's what's going to serve us over the long haul with regard to this Cold War with China.
And actually, along that line, I wanted to ask you, during the party conference, I believe Xi Jinping said that he wanted to accelerate the timetable of the reunification of China, meaning, Taiwan. So in sort of squaring it with what you said, do you think that's sort of like a Ronald Reagan Star Wars type of thing where, it's sort of pulling the hand of America to get us to spend more militarily? And should we ignore it? Or should we take them seriously and arm Taiwan? What's your opinion of how we should handle that looming conflict?
Well, so when the Soviet Union rolled tanks into Czechoslovakia, there was not a lot of that the United States can do. They had nuclear weapons. You create the possibility of nuclear war. The same thing exists with China and Taiwan. We don't have the conventional power to stop an invasion of Taiwan. And if we get into a war with China, we risk a nuclear war, which could be devastating for the whole planet. So I think we have to realize that if we're going to save Taiwan, it's going to be the long haul. It's not going to happen in the short term. And I think I do believe that we can see that invasion any time now.
Wow. Well, General, thank you. Thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's funny speaking with him about China. It's like that's the stuff that should be being discussed everywhere all the time, what's happening in regards to China. I mean, Russia too, of course, general geopolitics. But this weekend I was looking up some videos on social media, and the Hu Jintao video was making its waves around. But then most of the stuff in America is young kids rebelling against people who are trying to fight the trans stuff. It's like, people saying, this is a form of child abuse. No, this is a form of, protected health care, et cetera. This is the debate happening on social media. This is what the young people with all the energy and all the intelligence, that's the battle they're fighting, for and against. But it's like what General Spalding was just discussing, this China issue is just being ignored by the mainstream society, really society at large, right? Because they're focusing on these tangential. I guess that's my opinion, that there are tangential issues. But when you have an existential threat like a rising China, it's like everything pales in comparison to that, at least in my opinion. But it's totally being ignored. I mean, what do you think? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, on that too, we didn't get into it in the interview, but TikTok has been making headlines a bunch, and what's interesting to note with TikTok is that inside China and outside China, there's different algorithms. So inside China, TikTok is called Douyin, and there's a time limit on it for how long children can use it every night, and then what's promoted on your feed is academic success or these, students doing complicated videos, drawing, all these different skills, whereas in America, what's promoted is not that, and there's no time limit. And so, if we look at conventional war versus unconventional, that all plays in. But before we get into that more, we have another guest joining us after the break, Mike Barin, a comic book artist, and he's, famous for The Punisher, which you might have heard of. So we're going to hear more about him and what's going on there after a quick break.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. Now, our next guest is Mike Barin. He's an award-winning comic book creator. You might have actually seen some of his work on the Punisher series. However, since the Punisher has essentially been, you can say, neutered by Marvel, he decided to go independent and start his own brand of comic books. He created several. You might have heard of them. One was called Florida Man, and a new one is called Private American. Now, in his comic books, he tackles subjects which a lot of other comic books typically tend to ignore. These are conservative subjects, at least they are claimed to be conservative by the legacy news outlets, things like the U.S. southern border and the fentanyl crisis and things of that nature. And so he went independent. He began to produce these works. However, wouldn't you believe it? When he began to market his works on social media, the social media companies began to censor him. All right, joining us now is comic novelist and comic legend, Mr. Mike Baron. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. You know, I was actually traveling overseas recently. I was in the Netherlands and in Sri Lanka. And I actually noted it in my mind that in both places, I saw people having the Punisher logos displayed on their cars or on their clothing. So it's a very international brand. However, Marvel seems to be treating it sort of not in the way you would think they would treat a property as popular as that. So can you sort of set the stage for the audience? How has Marvel been treating the Punisher brand? And perhaps why?
Well, it seems to me that they're embarrassed by the character and they're looking for ways to quietly retire him. And it's not that the Punisher has changed, although he certainly changed in the hands of new writers. But the Punisher stood for protection of the innocent. He was a vigilante in the tradition of Charles Bronson and Death Wish, or Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry. And that was fine with people. And it probably still is fine with most people. But like many organizations in the entertainment business, Marvel has gone woke, and now the character embarrasses them.
Yeah, they even changed the logo, right? After police officers began using it alongside the Blue Lives Matter sort of movement, they actually changed the logo to be more like just different, right? It's not the same Punisher logo anymore. They even went so far.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. It looks like Cthulhu or something.
Wow. So what did you do when you saw this sort of culture forming around Marvel and pushing out sort of more conservative messaging? What did you wind up doing?
Oh, well, I haven't worked for Marvel in decades, and there are a whole bunch of us that used to work there. We're blacklisted because we're conservative. That doesn't bother me. We have our own audience and our own method of raising money, which is one of the reasons I launched Private American, because I looked at Marvel and I looked at what they were doing with the Punisher. It was all wrong. I mean, if the Punisher were being written by a rational human being, he'd be down to the southern border, trying to stanch the flow of fentanyl, human traffickers, and cartels and terrorists pouring into the country. And that's what the book is about.
Wow. And so you sort of went independent to make that comic book, right?
Yes, there's a whole bunch of us who do independent books.
Wow. And so then when you were doing the promotion of it on Twitter, Twitter actually suspended your account. Can you sort of tell that story? Why did that happen?
Well, we don't know because they won't give us a reason, but they suspended it a day after it was posted. They gave no reason and said it went against their standards. But you could spend the rest of your life looking for their standards and not have a clue. There was nothing risible in the page and really described the story and showed a little bit of art. I think we all know why Twitter suspended it, because it goes against the narrative.
Wow. Can you sort of maybe go a little deeper on that? Like, what specific narrative was it going against?
That the southern border is secure. That's one line that our beloved vice president keeps repeating. Or that we must welcome everyone who pours into this country with open arms and put them at the head of the line before our own homeless veterans and people. But the book isn't about that. The book shows compassion towards people who want a better life. I understand that, and my character, the Private American, understands that. His battle is with the people who are looking to get rich at our expense by shipping fentanyl into the country. And as you know, they've shipped enough fentanyl over the southern border to kill every American 5 times over. The cartels, their net worth ballooned. It was 1.3 billion in 2020. It's over 10 billion today, and that's due entirely to the open border. It's like the government is encouraging lawlessness.
And sometimes I wonder why more people don't know about it, or why more people aren't talking about it. But then there's stories like yours where you're actually not only talking about it, you're making art out of it, which in theory is some of the most protected type of speech in America, and yet you're even getting censored. Yeah.
I have to state that it's not a political book, except insofar as it respects national sovereignty. And my goal always is to entertain. It's a very gripping story, and if you pick it up and you start reading, you won't be able to put it down.
Last question, was this the first time that you got censored on social media? Because I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but a few years ago you had another comic called Florida Man, right? Didn't that experience some censorship as well?
Oh yeah, the day we posted that on Reddit, it was banned. I was banned. My very first post on Reddit, they said, you can't post here anymore. And the post was innocuous. And so was the Florida Man post. Florida Man is completely apolitical. Its only purpose is to make you laugh. But they have a number of administrators at Reddit who are aware that my friend Chris Brawley, who runs my campaigns, is head of Bleeding Fool, which is one of a handful of comic book news sites that handles comic book news from a conservative perspective. Why they banned me, I have no clue. You know, I don't attack other people. I don't even use sarcasm. But I guess somebody who's aware that I've been conservative, a lifelong conservative, and that's it. Conservatives are banned.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for telling us our story. And if there's any Punisher fans out there watching this segment right now, perhaps go check out Private American.
Thank you.
Take care. Wow, banned for making a comic book, you know?
Or trying to be entertaining.
Yeah. And what's funny is, like, you look at some of the older comic books from like let's say the 80s and the 90s. A lot of them had, you can say, political overtones, or they were sort of set amidst political, you know, happenings. Like a great example is The Watchmen. Like that's a great book, so good, and it had so many meanings you can sort of think about and meditate on later. You know, like about war and the way politicians lie to you, and sometimes even for your own safety. You know, there's like a lot of ways to look at that story and to really think about it. And even if let's say that's not the case, and somebody's beating you over the head with a message, it's still political speech, and it's like if it's not showing like nudity or outright, you know, whatever, you know, calls to action against someone, it's always just shocking to me that kind of stuff is censored. Yeah.
It really is shocking, like the state of what free speech has become in this country, right? And it seems that's one of the big issues as we head into the midterms especially. And our next guest, Rich Baris, director of Big Data Poll, and you know, he'll give us a whole glimpse into what the polling numbers are telling us ahead of the midterms. So that's coming up after a quick break. All right. Welcome back to Newsmakers. And Roman, it seems a lot of the topics we've been covering tonight really ties into the midterm elections, which are just right around the corner. Like with the comic book talking about the border, fentanyl earlier, education, FBI, you know, losing trust in our institutions, whether that's education or the FBI. The whole story is about the trauma being caused to the kids there. It's, you know, lots writing into these midterms, and our next guest is actually going to help shed some light on that and, you know, what we can expect in the midterms.
As you're likely well aware, the midterms are just around the corner, but the question is, what issues are top of mind for voters across the entire country? And so joining us now is Richard Baris, director of Big Data Poll and host of Inside the Numbers. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us, you actually, I believe, released a new poll last Friday. What exactly are the numbers telling us heading into the midterms?
The number one issue, well, first and foremost, we did have Republicans widening their lead in this latest poll to 5 points. And what really is happening here, guys, is that Republicans have a dominance on the issues that are most important to the voters this cycle. Democrats had basically bet the farm on abortion. They pushed, you know, a lot about the January 6th hearings. And the truth is, it's overwhelmingly an economic election. That's what's at the top of voters' minds. Between the economy and jobs, which is number 2, and inflation, which of course is number 1, there's almost half the electorate that is you know, concerned first and foremost about economics.
Yeah, I can definitely see why. I went grocery shopping this weekend, and it's like $7 eggs, 12 eggs for $7. I was like shocked. I can imagine that's like absolute top of mind for a lot of voters. let me ask you this. As a pollster, how do you account for a lot of the problems that I can imagine coming around in actually, being a professional person looking to conduct polls? For instance, like I know a lot of Republicans just don't want to answer polls. They get something in the mail, they get something online, they just think like big tech is watching me, I'm going to be put on some list if I answer this. They don't even want to answer. Do you sort of accommodate for that?
That's for many, many years I've argued that larger samples are the way to go to counter some of that response bias. It is getting worse this year, and I've been trying to talk about this quite a bit, where there's been a major problem with media and university pollsters understating Republican support because of a participation or response bias, and even social bias, like you said, where people are afraid or they don't want to, they're not comfortable being honest. But this year, it is possible that even I understate Republican support there. They just they don't want to talk, and when you get them, you have to basically handhold them.
And Richard, you mentioned the Republicans are up by 5 points. So how do we read these points? What do the points mean?
Yeah, so basically, Republicans have, I don't want to use the word advantage, but it matters a lot in the House of Representatives because, the blue districts are concentrated more urban and metro areas. So when you see these demographics that are fueling a lead that's around 5 points, it's a lot more damaging. Let me put it this way. A 5-point lead is a lot more damaging to Democrats if Republicans win it as opposed to if Democrats were to win the popular vote by 5, because it doesn't spread out into some of these other suburban areas and even rural areas. So it means more districts. It's more efficient. Let me put it that way. The national vote for Republicans is more efficient at the House level. That's a pretty much a good way to put it. And it's being fueled. Why does this matter? It's being fueled by independents who have a college education, which is something the Republicans were struggling with. And it's being fueled again by women. The gender gap is almost non-existent. Republicans are winning men overwhelmingly, but women are almost even. And the last time we saw this was 2014.
What do you make of this this strategy by the Democrats in the primaries that was reported on a few months back, where they were actually financing some of the campaigns of the Trump-backed candidates because their thinking was that they would be less electable for the general election, but it seems like actually now that plan might be backfiring. What effect did you see that had?
That's a great example of people thinking they're smarter than they are. If you take a district like Michigan 3, where John Gibbs is the Republican nominee, it could have been Peter Mayer, who voted to impeach Donald Trump, who voted for the January 6th Commission, who voted for the gun bill. And I actually polled that race several times, both for John Gibbs and publicly, separate. And the truth is that thinking was always backward. Peter Mayer would have lost to Hillary Clinton easily because there were just so many Republicans that were mad about his actions. They would have left him to flounder, and they would not have voted for him. They would have left that bubble blank. So that conventional wisdom, so to speak, was not very wise at all.
And Richard, as a pollster, what states are really standing out to you? Were there any surprises as you looked at the numbers?
There are. That's a great question. There are. I'm a little bit surprised that Pennsylvania, which we're polling actually right now, is a little bit closer in all of our polling that we've released and what we're seeing right now. It's a little bit closer than maybe I would have expected it to be, especially at the senatorial level. And then you take a state like Nevada, for instance, which I used to lament polling because it is one state where Republicans can sometimes be overstated, but that is not the case in recent elections anymore. That phenomenon is kind of out the window now. But Joe Biden was clearly overstated in 2020 in that state. And I was very surprised about the strength that both Joe Lombardo and Adam Laxalt had with Hispanics and in Clark County. So when I look at a state like that, it tells me that this move with Hispanics is real and that it's going to fly under the radar, and I think it's probably going to shock a lot of people.
Richard, last question. What is happening in Alaska? Because I'm looking at different predictions, and the governor is all red, deep red, Senate deep red, but then the House is blue, but they only have one House seat, so I would imagine it would be the same as the Senate race, but it seems to be different. Can you explain that?
It is, and it's because of the dynamic with the candidates. Another great question. We get a lot of questions about Alaska. You know, Lisa Murkowski, who is running for the Senate, I would argue in the long term or mid to long term, probably through Alaska to the Democrats, even though Republicans will get 60% of the vote for statewide offices. Because you have this dynamic with Begich and Palin, and there's just others that are involved. They don't like, the base likes Sarah Palin, but the more moderate Republicans do not, and they're actually more willing to put Mary Peltola as their second choice over Sarah Palin. So it's one of those instances where ranked choice voting was probably the stupidest thing Republicans could have done, and they're going to pay the price for it in down the road. They will, I have no doubt.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for your insights.
And thanks for having me. All the best. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a fun job, I imagine, polling, because like that's one example. Like Republicans sometimes, I imagine, respond less, but I can imagine so many other scenarios. Like even let's say a five-point average lead, but you know the House races and Senate races, they're all so specific. So you need to kind of get granular, and you need to poll specific regions, and you need to know, well, how's this specific race going to pan out, and what are the mail-in ballot laws in this particular race? You know, when does the polls close? When can we expect to see the results? Are there any early results we can know? You know, it's like all these little specifics are really interesting to me. I would love to get more into the polling action, but at the same time, it's tough, because if you predict incorrectly, then you get a bad reputation, right?
Does seem like a tough job, but also, like he mentioned, you know, independents or younger voters or women, especially after the Dobbs leak case earlier this year. So seems a lot's up in the air and a lot to think about as we head into the midterms.
Yeah, I was reading an analysis that the Dobbs case, the Democrats are saying, happened a little bit too early. If it happened like now, maybe it would have actually invigorated a lot of people. But like, again, $7 eggs is hard to work with. You know, the eggs thing is crazy, because I mean, I buy organic eggs, but like, you know, so it used to be $3, now it's $7. It's out of this world. Yeah. So a lot to think about as we're heading into the midterms. But you know what? There are things, Tiffany, outside of just each individual election cycle that perpetuated themselves well into, like, let's say the next year's election, the next year's election, the next 10 years election, right? And there's something I wanted to highlight today about one of those facts. So about 4 years ago, this country, America, we were experiencing a wave of illegal immigration that was coming through the U.S. southern border, just like we are now, but we were also experiencing it back then. And at that time, President Trump was attempting to get about $5 billion to build the wall that he promised to build while on the campaign trail. Now, right now, of course, $5 billion sounds like chump change, especially in regards to all the money that we sent over to Ukraine to protect their border. But back then, you might remember that Democrats in Congress were blocking that $5 billion appropriation with almost everything they had. And it was around that time when I watched an interview that was conducted by a reporter on the U.S. southern border. She was interviewing a man by the name of Trevor Loudon, who was explaining that, in his opinion at least, the deeper reasons for the Democrats attempting to block the flow of to block the blocking of the flow of illegal aliens. His main argument was that these illegal migrants, once in the U.S., once within our borders, they would invariably and overwhelmingly vote for the Democrat Party. And therefore, it would cement for them a perpetual margin of victory that would last for generations. Now, disparagingly, the legacy media in this country lumps his idea, that general idea, into the broad umbrella term of the racist Great Replacement conspiracy theory. However, is that really the case? Take the example of Washington, D.C. Just last week, the D.C. Council passed a new law allowing non-citizens, including illegal aliens, to vote in their local elections. Not federal elections, mind you, but in local D.C. races. These are things like the mayor, the council members, attorney general, school board members, as well as any initiatives, referendums, or recall elections that might happen to come up. Now, this particular bill, it passed the council, but it still has to be signed by the mayor to go into effect. However, the kicker is that even if the current mayor chooses to veto the bill, the district council does have enough votes to override the veto. Meaning, barring any unforeseen circumstances, what's going to happen is that non-citizens, including illegal aliens, will be voting in our nation's capital starting in the year 2024. And if you've been following this story for a while, you know that Washington, D.C. is not alone in this. In fact, with the passage of this law in D.C., it joined 15 other municipalities across the country which currently allow non-citizens to vote, including 2 in Vermont, 11 in Maryland, the city of New York, as well as San Francisco. Now, technically, this might actually be legal. If you're wondering, if you think this is illegal, that's not necessarily the case, because it is at least technically potentially legal. Because in our federalist system, the way it works with our federalist system is that the different states get to decide who votes in their local elections. So the federal government has already mandated that no illegal aliens or non-citizens can vote in federal elections, but the states can decide for themselves. And so far, only 5 states have explicit provisions in their state constitutions barring non-citizens from voting. However, if you think a little deeper into this issue, it's actually not so black and white, because very often the different mayors, attorney generals, and other officials within a given local municipality, they can become quite famous on a national stage. For instance, take the example of the 2020 Democrat primary election. On stage, there were a lot of candidates, but 2 of them, and 2 of the most prominent ones, were politicians who were made famous by being mayors. You have Pete Buttigieg and Bill de Blasio. They were famous because they were mayors of their local municipalities. Furthermore, many of the people who wind up in higher office outside of the presidency, in things like the Senate, the House, or the governor in the governor's mansion, they very often start out their political career by running, winning, and then gaining name recognition for their work at the local level. Many times, that's just the way this political system works. It's like a pipeline, right? Just like in a sports league, you have the collegiate level, you have college, you have the junior league level, and then you have the pros. And so what this all means is that if this trend continues, if more and more municipalities, including large important cities like New York, DC, and San Francisco, if they continue to allow non-citizens and even sometimes illegal aliens to vote in their local elections, well, what will happen? The political apparatuses will be elected by those non-citizens, with those politicians then moving quicker into the pipeline for higher office. It would, as the interview I watched 4 years ago, create for the Democrats something like a perpetual margin of victory that could last for generations, and possibly create cities that are even more so ruled by just one party, which then, again, naturally enough, affects elections at the federal level, even though technically federal law prohibits it. So that's just something I was thinking about after I was, reading all this news about the local midterm elections, because again, that's like it's important locally, but then you look out over the next 10 years and it's like, what's really going to affect change in our election system? And that's just a train of thought. It's something that I think should be talked about more.
Well, definitely lots to chew on right there, as you mentioned. And that's all from us tonight here on Newsmakers. We're back next Wednesday with a brand new show, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.